people in the room. The recording started. The chat box is open for everybody to join in. So let's go and talk VAT, because you know how much I love doing that. For those of you who haven't met me before or seen me at all, my name is Liz Maher. I'm one of the directors here at Zenadin Centurion Indirect Tax. Slight change on the branding, still the same people, still the same company, but a new logo, a new branding, which I'm slowly getting around to getting out there so that people can join in and see. And basically what we've done, as you know, we're a specialist VAT team, but we now sit within a much larger accountancy group, which is one of the top 20 accountancy practices now in the UK and Ireland. So lots more services that we can bring for our VAT related clients to bear. So that's what the new branding is all about. But you're not here to talk about the new branding. We're here because we were wanting to talk about the VAT consultation that's out on the energy saving materials. It's going on until the 31st of May, and I'm really encouraging people to engage in this discussion. I think it's really important that taxpayers of all types and natures of operations can have a say in influencing what is a really important policy if we're going to move forward into the area of net zero, reducing carbon emissions. And VAT, surprisingly, is a mechanism, a tax mechanism that can be used effectively to change people's behaviour, you know, to encourage people to do things differently. Now, I'm going to do this session about energy saving materials specifically. I have got a little poll just to launch, just so I know the sort of types of people who are in the room. So if I just launch that one, if you could just sort of let me know your backgrounds. It's not a very sophisticated poll. It's just to find out what sort of organisations are in the room listening to today, whether you're actually an installer, whether you're a customer, what type of customer, because a lot of you will be quite VAT sensitive. So I've just put that out there just to get a sense. At the moment, we haven't got anybody who's sort of from a local authority or national government. And I do think national government, particularly devolved administrations, should be more aware of these issues than they are. But again, that's my particular hobby horse. So I'll just wait for people just to tap in on that. There's 32 people in the room at the moment. I'll just close that poll down in a couple of count of 5, my usual thing. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Lovely. Thank you very much for those people. And I'll just sort of let people sort of see the nature of the people who are in the room. So hopefully you can see that poll on the screen. We can see, obviously, we've got a fair number of housing associations, universities, a number of advisory firms, and a couple of actual installers. I think I would be really interested in your comments, particularly about new technologies. And for those of you in the housing or university sector, if you've got contact with your development teams who are looking at what to bring into your buildings, I think that's a really important a piece of information to have. So I'll put that to one side. Now, I'm not going to assume anything. I've always found that is dangerous on VAT. So I'm just going to put a couple of slides to make sure we understand why we're talking about this and the context we're talking about. So as we know, VAT is a tax on a transaction. We make supplies of goods and services, construction services, installation of equipment fall into that category of being a supply of goods with services. And we're looking at the goods element when we're talking about the energy saving materials, but it's all wrapped up in that single supply of a service, an installation. Now, when we're dealing with VAT, we know that if we're in a business that makes taxable supplies, those taxable supplies that we make out allow us to recover VAT on our costs. So VAT flows through those types of organisations. They incur VAT on their costs. They claim it back because it relates to taxable sales that they're making. But not everybody, and particularly those people on this discussion group this morning, not everybody is in the same position as that, because a lot of other people involved, particularly in this call, will be making business supplies. But as you can see from that little cursor there, they'll be making supplies which are exempt from VAT. So for those of you who are in advisory roles or in businesses looking to install things, if you're dealing with a customer or a client who's VAT exempt, that will mean they have an inability. They will be unable to recover VAT on the costs that relate to their exempt supplies. So universities make exempt supplies of education. Housing associations make exempt supplies of social housing rents. The charities that are on the call, equally, you might be making non-business supplies, but you also might be making exempt welfare supplies. So exempt means VAT is blocked on your recovery. And that brings us back into this conversation about, well, why are we worrying about getting a lower rate of VAT on energy saving materials? Well, if we're in a position where we cannot recover VAT, to know that we're not having to pay it out is an actual bonus to our budgets. It means we're not spending money on a VAT cost that we cannot recover because it relates to either a non-business activity or an exempt business activity. So that's why these VAT reliefs on energy saving materials are so important. So for those of you who are involved in exempt business activities or have clients involved in exempt business activities, they will be looking at how can I reduce VAT? Housing stock, obviously, student residences relating to the exempt provision of education, the costs that we're incurring in order to improve that, to reduce our carbon footprint, to reduce our energy costs, to make a greener agenda achievable. This is where this conversation sits in place. So the things below the dotted line, those are areas where you are not doing anything by way of business, because VAT is a tax on your business activities, and they're equally in a position, in the main, equally in a position of not being able to recover VAT on their costs. So that's where the people who are in the charity sector making non-businesses, there are some exceptions to this, and being quite broad brush on that, but in terms of the general rules, that's the line that we'll take. So how does energy saving materials, how do we know what to do with the VAT treatment on energy saving materials, whether as a person supplying those items or as a consumer looking to say, well, actually, what does the law allow me to get at the zero rate or the reduced rate? Well, it's the law that tells us, and I've just listed for the sake of completeness the various VAT schedules that are relevant to the discussions that we'll be having. Now, when we talk about what's the VAT liability of supply, for me, there are three key points that we need to look at. We need to look at what is the nature of the supplier, that can affect the liability of the supply. What is the actual nature of the supply? And then is the liability affected by the nature of the customer? So there will be times when a supply would be subject to VAT, and there will be other times when the same supply is not subject to VAT, because the customer perhaps is a charitable institution and therefore can access some VAT reliefs. In the same way as in terms of energy saving materials, before the change that we had last year, there would have been housing associations that could have accessed the reduced rate of VAT on energy saving materials because they were registered social landlords. So all of these factors come into play. But the important point to remember is that the law determines the tax. And it's HMRC that interprets the law, and we're entitled as taxpayers, as advisors, to interpret the law as well. And that interpretation is where we get problems, particularly in this area of energy saving materials at the moment, because HMRC are interpreting the rules in a particular way, which actually a number of us would say isn't reflected in the legislation, which brings us back to the point of the consultation is to have a voice. And we'll go through the questions that are in the consultation, and you'll be able to see hopefully how that would be built in and how you can influence it. Somebody, as Jules has put in the chat box, we really need people to engage with the consultation, because as Julie's saying in the chat box, if you don't ask, you don't get on this one. So a slide I've just put up to remind people perhaps who are in the advisory side of life, what businesses, or even in the supplier side of life on this, what businesses are VAT sensitive, what organisations are VAT sensitive. And it's those organisations that are going to be really affected by, if VAT is incorrectly charged to them, if VAT is charged at the full rate when there's a VAT relief, that they should access. And this is a sector where the consultation is driving at as well, because it does talk now about re-engaging with charities in terms of being able to access the VAT reliefs that apply to energy saving materials. Right, okay, so I've hopefully given a little bit of a backdrop as to how VAT works in a transactional sense, how it affects people who are VAT sensitive and unable to recover VAT, and why this consultation is so important. Now, I've just put in a couple of slides now just to explain, actually, Liz, what are you talking about when you come to energy saving reliefs? Well, there's one area which I'll just flag up very quickly, because there are two aspects. One is on grant funded heating systems, which is again a quite specific relief. As you can see, it's talking about grant funded installations of heating equipment. That's quite a widely drafted VAT relief, because it's sort of heating equipment, not these specific energy saving materials, but it's specific to people over 60 and in receipt of benefits. So there is that grant funded relief that is out there at the moment. So fine, noted that, put that to one side, because what we're actually really more interested in today is what are these energy saving materials that we're engaging in conversation with the revenue. Now, there has been a change. As I mentioned, these would have been items that would have been subject to the reduced rate. So the reduced rate is the 5% VAT rate up to the period of the 31st of March, 2022. So that would have been up to the reduced rate treatment. Now, in order to encourage people to engage and have these types of materials fitted, there's a zero rate, which means it's a taxable supply. It's charged at 0%. And that's something for those of you who are suppliers to recognise. If it's a taxable supply, you're at no risk in terms of losing VAT recovery on your costs. Because remember what I said at the outset, taxable supplies allow you to recover VAT that supports the making of those taxable supplies. Zero rated supplies are taxable. They're just taxable at 0%. So you're helping your customer by not charging VAT quite correctly. You're not risking your ability to recover VAT on your costs. So that's an important message, because often we see suppliers going, oh, I'm not sure I want to do this. Taxable supplies, this is still what we're making. Now, up until the supplies of the 31st March 2022, we were talking about a situation where the services of installing these items was zero rated, and the goods value could qualify as long as the values were less than 60% of the value of a supply. Now, the really important thing to note is that that 60% rule never applied to housing associations. So there's a bit of a nuance in there. Now we're in the situation of these rules about 60% not applying at all. It is simply that we have a supply, it is of energy saving materials, and we're going to use the word qualifying now, qualifying energy saving materials, and that is sufficient to get it across the line in terms of accessing the zero rates. So that's why people are really interested in this. And that's why it's seen as an encouragement to take away the 5%, take away these criteria as goods and value, and then just simply say it's zero rated for this window. And that's another important aspect just to note. There is a window. So for those of you who have got longer term estate teams who are looking at longer term objectives around refurbishing properties on the estates, campuses, student accommodation, or even housing stock, this window of opportunity closes on at the end of March 2027. So this might influence the way in which you bring work forward in order to get it into this zero rating relief. Now, I do make a note on this slide, and this is important, to check that actually suppliers have applied the correct treatment in the last 4 years, because Julie and ourselves in the Centurion VAT team have had a number of situations where suppliers have not applied the VAT rules correctly. And that means that VAT sensitive clients have paid 20% VAT when they should have only paid 5%. So don't sit on your laurels. Do have a think about, is there stuff in the history that actually you should be going back over to check? Now, when we talk about energy saving materials, we also have to recognise it's only at the moment in terms of use in specific buildings and types of buildings that these qualifying energy saving materials can access the zero rating relief. The phrase is referred to as residential accommodation. But what does that mean? And in the context of this zero rating relief, it means dwellings, houses, flats, buildings that are used for a relevant residential purpose. So that would be where student accommodation would come into play, and other sort of relevant residential accommodation, sheltered care schemes, and those sorts of things. It also talks about caravans, which are used as permanent homes. So this is not caravans in a holiday park sense. It's caravans used as permanent homes. And funny enough, I was in London on the weekend by one of the canals, and sort of, yeah, houseboats are included in here as well. So, you know, understanding what's meant by the phrase relevant residential accommodation. So we're just going through the basic building blocks as to what sorts of things qualify in order to get your brains and your energies thinking about, well, actually, what about this going forward? Because that's the bit we need to get into the consultation. So we've talked about what the rule is. It's zero rating. We've talked about that it's a window that the zero rating can qualify for up to March 2027. We've talked about the fact it has to be equipment that's installed in residential accommodation at the moment. What are the items that are listed as the qualifying items? Right, so here they are. This is the list as it stands at the moment. It was changed in the spring budget of 2022, and wind and water turbines were added. So what we're talking about is insulation, but look how it's worded: insulation for walls, floors, ceiling, roofs, or lofts, or for water tanks, pipes, or other plumbing. Insulation has had its moments in the court recently. We've had issues around roofing tiles, which are, you know, have insulating properties, and they have failed to meet the criteria under the current definition of what is insulation that is allowable as a qualifying material. So again, that's something for us to think about, the way in which new technology is creating different products which will save energy, but they're not included in this particular list at the moment. So it's insulation on walls, in roof space, not on necessarily the roof itself. Draft stripping. There's a bit of me that thinks, you know, these words are actually quite old. Do we still do draft stripping? Perhaps we do on older properties, but we're talking more about double glazing and getting energy efficient windows. And yet double glazing windows, triple glazing, are not included in the qualifying list. So again, is that something that we should be saying, well, hang on, guys, you know, if you're talking about actually trying to make sure you save energy in the home, double glazing ticks that box. So why isn't it included? They get quite pedantic, these things. So for example, on central heating systems, it's specific to the controls. Those valves, thermostatic valves you put on a new radiator, those are the items that are qualifying for the relief, not the new central heating system, because the new central heating system, unless it's going to be something that's powered by, you know, solar panels or ground source heat pumps, the new central heating with a new gas boiler that just happens to be more fuel efficient is not a qualifying item. It's only the valves on there. And this is also where we get into the, hang on, what is the nature of the supply? That part of that conversation. Because The revenue at the moment will take the view you cannot split a single supply and just get the zero rating on the bits that qualify. So for example, if you're putting in a new gas boiler, energy efficient gas boiler, you're putting in new boiler, new radiators, and on those radiators, you put the energy efficient valves. What you're getting is a single supply of a new central heating system. You can't then just isolate and say, I won't charge VAT on the valves bit. Now that's that single supply argument that the revenue will use. Now that gets more difficult, and that's where the issues are at the moment when we're talking about major refurbishments and major energy efficiency projects on, say, housing stock. And we've had practical examples of situations where you are putting on external wall insulation, which ticks the box under the first bullet point. It's insulation for a wall, it's external, and it goes on. But that changes the pitch of the roof. It changes the aperture of the windows. Now, the work that's needed to change that pitch of the roof, is that ancillary to the fact that it was triggered by having the energy wall insulation fitted? There's two different views we're getting from HMRC at the moment. We would argue that yes, it is. It's ancillary to that happening. But we've also had practical situations where we've got a lot of scaffolding going up on a lot of housing units to put energy wall insulation. And on some of those housing units, we will be doing some repairs, which are just separate to the supply of the energy saving wall insulation, but we're taking advantage of the fact the scaffolding is up. And we've had a running debate with HMRC on this one at the moment. Well, those roof repairs, they're separate from the insulation. So I've got two supplies happening at the same time. Why can't I get zero rating on the insulation works and I accept I'm going to get 20% on the repair works? And that's about being able to argue and put the case that there are two supplies. It's just happening within one contract. And that's not an unusual situation to find yourself in, but it is one that's quite contentious with the revenue at the moment. So just to come back to where we are, what we're saying is, what are the qualifying items? This is the list of what the qualifying items are, but it's how they are supplied often that can cause us issues in being able to access the reliefs as they stand. There's other things on here. We talk about energy efficiency and improving energy consumption in the home. Damp proofing, for example, is not an item that's included in here. So again, there may be different things that need to be considered. And that's part of the challenge. That's part of the conversation. So as I say, the challenges that we've been having at the moment with the revenue, primarily, we're not allowed to isolate these particular items within a bigger contract unless we can argue that that bigger contract is covering two distinct supplies. And there is HMRC guidance that we can rely on, or we can use anyway, in terms of that argument that actually we've got two supplies going on in there. One of their internal guidance notes use the specific example of installation of draft stripping for windows, and at the same time the builder's putting some bookshelves up. Now HMRC give that as a specific example of saying, yeah, the draft stripping is unconnected with the putting up the bookshelves. I can separate those two supplies out and I can access the relief on the insulation and the draft stripping, because draft stripping is included in the qualifying list, and I can use the zero rating reliefs on that. So it's interesting the way they seem to be drawing the line between, you know, when is a single supply and when is it actually a number of supplies happening, albeit at the same time. Projects that have a mix of works, the other challenges that we're facing is this discussion as to, yeah, well, I'm installing the external wall insulation and I'm doing this work on the pitch of the roof, but I'm only doing that pitch on the roof works because I've installed the external wall insulation. So we have these discussions as to what's meant by integral, ancillary, incidental, because those are the words that are used and it's how we interpret them. Now, for those of you who've been involved in the retrofitting of cladding on residential blocks of flats, and you know, this has all been triggered obviously by the terrible tragedy at Grenfell. Even in this environment, we're finding that there has been a challenge, because often that cladding, there are two arguments about that cladding. One is the building that you built was a zero-rated block of flats. It was not fit for purpose because of the way in which the fire regulations have been regarded since, and therefore you should be able to access zero rating on putting that new retrofitted cladding on it. HMRC are pushing back on that in a number of cases that we've seen and saying, oh, well, that's only if you've taken on legal dispute with the actual supplier. That's the only situation that that's not what the actual case law that went through the court says. But these are the sorts of ways in which it's been challenged. Now, obviously, if that cladding is insulation, external wall insulation, we have a different conversation to have about, does it qualify either under the old reduced rate reliefs, or if we were doing it now under the zero rating reliefs. And I suppose this is why we have conversations. This is why you have people like myself and Centurion and Julie, who are interested, sad I know, we're interested in VAT. And it's because we have to challenge these nuances about the plans that people put in place and the rebuttals that they get from HMRC to make sure actually it is within the scope of the legislation. That is the intention. I've also seen a number of situations where government funding, there's an awful lot of government funding has been coming out, particularly in the devolved administrations that we work in our area with. And I'm afraid to say that grant funding that's come out to the housing sector specifically doesn't seem to take account of that sensitive environment in which a housing association finds itself. I think sometimes government, because those government bodies can recover their VAT on supplies, even if it relates to their non-business activity, if they're supplies of services, they make that assumption, well, everybody can recover VAT. And that is absolutely not the case when we're talking about our housing association or even our charity sector. So again, that grant money is coming through. It's quite chunky sums. We're talking, you know, a few million, but government funding people are saying, well, you can't use that to fund your irrecoverable VATs. So all of a sudden that £3 million you've got doesn't fund £3 million worth of external wall insulation. It funds a VAT inclusive project for external wall insulation if you can't get zero rating on it. So as I say, that's the sort of interaction all the time. These are the sorts of challenges. And I have to say, procurement approaches and procurement policies sometimes are working against us. Remember that point I said about, well, actually, if we have a nice, simple, single supply of external wall insulation, it stands on its own. But of course, procurement may well try and bundle things together into a contract and put in place things that make the VAT interpretation of it a bit difficult. So it's always good to talk with not just finance colleagues about this and development colleagues, but also procurement departments, whether you're in a university, a housing association, or any other larger public body. The chat's very quiet, so I presume everybody's okay. You're all right out there, aren't you? So what's the consultation? So we're halfway through. What's the consultation that has been launched now? What was announced in the budget this year was, as I say, was this call for evidence. Now, the questions are quite specific, and as I say, we will sort of go through those questions. They're putting out questions around battery storage, new technologies, and this point I've made already about whether charities can come back into the relief as being an entity that can access zero rating on the supply and installation of energy saving materials. It has to be said, charities were in here a decade ago. They were taken out because of challenges through the European courts. And then now we're having that conversation about bringing them back into the fold in order to access zero rating relief. Again, in certain specific circumstances, but where they're using buildings for relevant charitable purposes. However, all of these questions have been placed by HMRC in their documentation and the Treasury in terms of the 3 key objectives that need to be met. And I'd like to encourage you to think about how you would argue your case around these objectives. What they're saying is, if you're going to argue for something to be included, you've got to be able to provide a case that says it will, this item, this service, this supply will improve energy efficiency in the home and will reduce carbon emissions. It's also got a cost effectiveness, and that's cost effective in the sense of the Treasury. And it's also got this point about aligning with broader VAT principles, which is this point about the rules that we've got as to, you know, what's a single supply and what could be split. So just to put a bit more information on top of that, what I'm saying is the primary purpose should be that the item, the qualifying energy saving materials item, should reduce fossil fuel energy demands. It should make consumers move away from fossil fuel. It should encourage them to do it, or it should involve a reduction in the use of fossil fuels. And that could be from, it's an item which is going to produce energy production on site, or, and this is where it gets interesting, sorry, it's interesting, improve capacity to retain and preserve energy within a property. So you know, this is where, you know, you might be sort of saying, well, double glazing, you know, improves the capacity to retain energy within a property. Equally, there may be other technologies out there. So this is the first objective that's set. Can we reach this bar? Will it do this? It doesn't include things that are more energy efficient. So like white goods, you know, you buy a new washing machine, it's got a better energy capacity. That's not what this is aimed at. This is aimed at something which is a piece of material that will reduce the energy demands in the home from fossil fuel, or create energy or preserve that energy. And as I say, white goods, at the moment, those sorts of items are excluded from this. This point about cost effectiveness, what they're driving at, they, as in the government, Treasury policy, HMRC, is saying, well, the relief, if we're going to give away tax revenue, because that's what they'll be doing, they'll not be collecting 20%, they'll get zero tax on this supply. So to be cost effective, that reduction in revenue has got to do something positive. It's got to change the behaviour of the consumer and encourage them to do all these things that we've been talking about. Now, you could argue that every step is cost effective because, you know, we've got net zero targets, we've got targets, 2030 to achieve in terms of driving down our dependency on fossil fuels and reducing our carbon footprint. But they're trying to find a way to measure and manage that. So think about that in the consultation. What is the value that will be given to the wider economy from these materials if they're included in the list? And as I say, this final point is, well, we can't tweak the rules to squeeze them into a way that would potentially give somebody a case to say, well, hang on, you've allowed them to do this over here. In my area of business, I'm supplying, you know, widgets over here. Why can't I do the same? You're saying they can split things. Why can't I do it in the same way? So, as I say, there's a bit of a point of contention around this sort of splitting aspect. Personally, you know, I think the greater goal is to reduce energy consumption from fossil fuels, to drive business production, creation of new jobs in these new areas. I think that's a much better sort of objective to have, but we have to recognise that people will take tax law and exploit it in a way that perhaps you wouldn't have thought was going to be the intention. So those are the 3 objectives that anything that we talk about needs to sit behind. So what are the areas of questions? Batteries is specifically in there. Now, that's because if you look at the supply of solar panels, and I can speak from experience because we've had solar panels put in at home, what we decided to do was to maximize the use of that to preserve the capacity of the green energy that produced. We would buy a battery in order to be fitted, and we had that all done at the same time. So it was a supply and fit solar panels with a battery, and that's discussion about, well, the battery is ancillary, it's integral to the delivery of the green energy, and so it's all wrapped up as one supply. But what happens if that battery was supplied on its own at a later point, retrofitted? The law doesn't say that batteries are a qualifying energy saving material. So this seems like an easy win for me, for us to be able to argue, yeah, of course batteries should be included in this, because it's ancillary, it's integral to the main supply, which is I'm having solar panels, or I might be having air source heat pumps or wind turbines or anything else. So that's an example of, how batteries, I believe, should firmly be included in there. But is it enough that it's standalone if it's supplied at a later point? How do we deal with this? And the questions will always come back to making sure, how does it meet those three criteria, those three objectives? And the questions ask us to explain, I mean, we're talking about batteries, but there may be other energy storage technologies out there. And this is where the industry really needs to jump on board, or estates teams who are working with the industry in your universities or in your housing associations to be able to say, hang on, guys, this is the technology that's going to be here 2 years down the line. This is the thing that needs to be taken into account in this VAT legislation. So batteries deal with the questions 1 to 6. Then there are the questions around, well, what other technologies are out there? I've put up on the side intelligent energy systems. That's something I've come across when we've been talking with our housing associations. And it seems to me, and I apologise for my my lack of technical knowledge, but it seems to me that these are systems, electronic components that are installed perhaps separately after, but could be done at the same time as solar panels going on a load of housing units. And what these intelligent energy systems do is provide information and data in order to maximize the use of the green energy that's being produced. Now, if they were provided as part of the supply, you'd think, well, there's an argument there. But the concern, I think, that's currently with these intelligent energy systems is they're actually expensive items in their own right. The project that I saw, the solar panel value was slightly less than the installation of the intelligent energy systems. So it's a question as to these mechanisms that say, actually, guys, now is the time, the capacity is there, now is the time for the tenant to switch on the washing machine. Do it now because it's drawing on that energy. All these sorts of components that go as part of this intelligent energy systems. It says nothing about systems controls in terms of the qualifying materials. So that's one example of something that I've come across that I'd sort of, well, actually, I don't think it's on the list in itself. Is it integral or ancillary to the installation of the supply? And ancillary suggests or implies it's of lower value. Well, these are quite expensive pieces of kit. So that's an example of something. But there will be lots of other examples of new technologies. And again, for each technology, the question set will come, how does that technology meet these objectives? How will it change people's behaviour? How will it evidence it is cost effective? And how will it evidence that it doesn't undermine any broader VAT principles? So this is where those of you with knowledge of this can really come into play. Now, hydrogen is another area that we hear a lot of in the press, and I recently saw an engineering firm that had produced some major hydrogen energy boilers for sector to use. So hydrogen may be the sort of thing. There's no mention of hydrogen in the current list. But again, I put it out there. You know, I'm a VAT person. You've probably got a lot more experience as to the new technologies that are coming down the line. And this is where legislation really does need to play, not just catch up, but have a bit of foresight as to what is coming down the line in terms of what can come into the consumer market. Because we've seen the way in which electric vehicles have grown. I think 15% of cars sold at the moment are pure electric vehicles. And you wouldn't have been doing that even 2-3 years ago. You wouldn't have seen that volume. And electric vehicles are changing all the time in terms of their range, which is encouraging people to buy into them. But there's also this sort of thing, well, I'll wait till the more efficient car comes along and I'll buy that one. So we really need to have a bit of foresight as to what technologies are coming down the line. So new technologies, have a think about that in the context of the areas that you're working in, that you are seeing on the line. The next bulk set of questions, there are only, I think, 19 questions in all, is around charities. So remember, I said the reliefs as they're structured at the moment are directed not to a charity, but they're directed to any person who's looking at this in the terms of residential accommodation, these materials being fitted in residential accommodation. So the question that's now being asked is, do you think that the relief for the installation of the qualifying energy saving materials in a building that's not intended for residential use, but is intended solely for relevant charitable use, should be reinstated? So that would be buildings, perhaps day centres, you know, it could be any type of building where the charity that is running that building is using that building solely for non-business purposes. And this is where it gets a bit sort of sticky, because it has to be non-business. It's not that it's zero-rated supplies, there's no VAT on them, or exempt business supplies. It's that it must not be used for a business purpose. Or if it is used for a business purpose, then it has to be solely, as in 95% used for non-business. There's this little sort of margin of 5% that could come into play. So for those of you who've put on the sort of list that you're from the charity sector, this is your area of opportunity to look at the way in which you can improve your carbon footprint, not have to pay VAT on the costs of doing so, as long as the building qualifies for non-business purposes. And I'd just like to comment. Andrea Marshall. Andrea is sits on the British University's Directors of Finance Group, and Andrea's been doing an awful lot in terms of the university sector, and she would universities and charities. And when you're talking about, she's made the point about laboratories in a charity environment, in a university environment. Now, a research lab, which doing publicly funded research, that lab is actually a non-business building. It's non-business activities because it's doing publicly funded research. And she's made the comment here that, you know, research labs use more than up to 4 to 6 times more than a normal office. So if we were able to get charities back into the zero rating reliefs, the energy saving works that related to a building that housed research laboratories, that would, you know, fit the bill, and it would mean that VAT wouldn't have to be paid, which means the university's then got more money in its budgets to spend on the research and the delivery of education. And this is where I sort of see that the cost benefit sometimes, you know, you can't just measure it in pound, shilling and pence. It's that ripple effect as to how these reliefs will actually benefit further down the line. So thanks for that, Andrea. That's a useful example to include. So back to charities, as I say, they're asking, well, what sort of energy saving materials are you thinking of installing in your charitable building? What do you think the advantages and disadvantages are of reinstating the relief? So again, all important points to have a voice on. And then the final bit that's in the consultation is basically a catch-up. Is there any other suggestions that you have for making the relief more efficient and effective? Are there any other issues that you would like to raise? Great open questions. And it's really important that we put in there, we don't know all the technologies. HMRC don't know all the technologies. One suggestion would be to, make sure that they engage directly with industry groups who are dealing in these sorts of green technologies, that they have some input from those innovators in that space in order to formulate legislation that isn't going to be in 5 years' time redundant for use because things have moved on. We're no longer doing draft stripping, which is like one of the things in here. We're now talking about some coating that goes on the wall, because one of the words in here that does cause us problems at the moment is installed. And there's a debate going on with the revenue as to, well, that installed is different from applied. So if you're applying a technology to a wall, a paint or something, it's not installed in the conventional sense as to the way the language is used in the law. So these are all important little nuances, and this is why drafting legislation is so important to us. Now, the link to the consultation, you can respond any which way you want. You can do it on your own. There are organisations sat on this call that have got representative roles, and Andrea at Bufdug with the universities, Community Housing Cymru in terms of the housing associations, National Housing Federation. All of these umbrella organisations are really important routes to having a voice. But the more that we engage in this consultation, the more voices, the volume of voices, in terms of the range, is so important to demonstrate this is actually a fundamentally important issue. So you might choose to, say, respond through an umbrella organisation. We at Centurion, within the Zenadin group, we will be responding as in our advisory role, and I'll be interested to hear from any of my colleagues across the nations in the Zenadin group in terms of what their clients are hearing about and what they'd like to have recognised. So there's a link in the slide pack, and yes, I will be sending out the slide pack as well. So you can use that. In terms of your own response, you can email that document that you produce. You can send it by post. If you just indicate when you respond to that, whether you're responding as an organisation or as an umbrella, so that they've got some sense as to where the voices are coming from. But that's the actual practical side of the process. But as I say, what is so important is to understand the limitations of the legislation that exists at the moment. And I hope today I've been able to explain where those limitations sit, to also understand the challenges that we're getting from the revenue in terms of the interpretation of the law in its current form. And can we work to a way in which those challenges can be removed, because we've got real clarity as to what is or isn't included and how it should be treated. So hopefully, in terms of the conversation that we've been able to do, you've understood the current context and you've got information now about the way in which the consultation can work. If you want to respond via us, that's absolutely fine. I've got a little feedback poll that I'll put up. But has anybody got any sort of questions that they want to sort of put into the chat box? I'm not even sure. I mean, I think I can probably unmute people. So Andrea, do you want to, is there something you'd like to say from the research that you've done? So I'm going to allow Andrea Marshall to talk, just in case there is something, Andrea, that you want to bring into the mix. So I've unmuted you, Andrea.
Can you hear me?
Can do, Andrea.
Brilliant. Yeah. I'm always a bit nervous on this. I really want to emphasize the longevity point of the legislation, because it takes HMRC such a long time to get anything amended. And what I've been trawling through the internet for is trying to find examples of future technology that we can include in the list. So, but it is like going down a rabbit hole. You find so much information on there. So if anybody that is a supplier does have sort of a high level list that they could share with us, I'd be really grateful, because I could then include it in my response. For example, I've found some things about different types of batteries. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my response to that question. So it's just making sure that they don't just say batteries and limit it, but actually limit it when they draft the legislation, but actually encompass sort of future types of oh, here we go, compressed air energy storage. I found mechanical gravity energy storage, flow batteries. I don't know what any of that means really. But really having a list of that sort of thing that we can put to HMRC, I think would be really, really useful. The other thing I thought as well is, we've talked a lot about energy efficiency, but obviously as we get in hotter summers, there's the whole thing about keeping properties cooler as well. And picking up on your point about roofing, I have found some stuff that says, you know, that there's some roofing panels and things now that actually help to keep a property cooler as well as conserve heat. So I think there's probably a wider issue there. I mean, flooding is the other obvious area that, since this legislation was drafted, has become a major problem for the country. But I doubt if that, I have mentioned that in my response as well. And I mean, what I've done as well is I've just included loads of links to things I've found online about, you know, what a battery does. And there's lots of really useful stuff I found on the National Grid website. So
I think the Energy Saving Trust is a good source of information as well.
I've gone onto that as well. But when it comes to obviously for us for research labs, it's really important that we can try and get the 0 rating back, because obviously research public funded, it doesn't get any of the VAT back, as you've said. So and is very energy intensive. So anything we can do to sort of encourage the use of green energy would be brilliant. But I just, my main thing, Liz, if people could share that list with you and you could pass it on of things to just put in as examples of future technology, I'd really welcome that.
Monsina's just put in the chat box. I'm not sure if it's because Monsina knows about this, but she made a comment about heat reflective paints, which probably picks up on what you're talking about in terms of things getting warmer. In that technology. I mean, technology is moving on all the time. I mean, there are cars that are being built now with you know, solar panel technology laid into the body of the vehicle. I mean, that's the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about in terms of where this technology is going. And I take your point, Andrea, about, you know, flooding. I suppose what you'll find, isn't it, that they'll say, well, this is about energy saving materials. And, you know, if we're talking about environmental measures, then that's probably going to be in a different piece of the law. But I mean, it's a valid point in terms of, you know, dealing with our changing climate, isn't it? So,
but I think perhaps something that actually helps to keep a property cool, and that was interesting, the comment just about apartments and sort of anti-heat reflection on windows. I understand that there's some windows as well that have something built into the glass which helps to reflect. So, I mean, I've included those as examples.
Yes, but, I mean, Pilkington, I think, had a range of glass that they were devising. So whether that's a source of useful information, I don't know. But no, that's brilliant. As I say, Andrea, as I say, sits atop the university's finance group in terms of their indirect tax commentary, and she's always a great participant in our discussions on VAT across issues. So if we can help her in terms of any ideas or issues that you've seen in terms of technology out there, then, you know, by all means, send it across. You've got our contact details, and we'll forward that on. We'll use it ourselves in our own response as well, because the more the merrier. This isn't an exclusive club, is it, Andrea?
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think the more repetition we get, the better, to be honest, because it hammers the message home then to them.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. There's a couple. Thanks, Andrea. Appreciate that. There's a couple of other comments in the chat box, which I'll just run through in terms of difficulties that people are having with contractors who don't understand and are reluctant to use. And yes, we are finding that, but we're also finding that with, you know, good, sensible conversations, we are able to get them across the line. In the vast majority of cases, a lot of them, as I say, a lot of contractors are nervous because they're the people who've raised the invoice. So obviously, quite rightly, they're going, well, if I haven't charged VAT on it and I've got it wrong, it's going to be me they come to. Well, you know, you can always have conversations about protecting that position. But factually, if the issue is correct, the issue is correct. And we're also seeing that HMRC, Julie and our team has had a number of situations where HMRCs have been quite threatening in terms of, you know, rattling sabres and threatening assessments, but we've actually yet to see assessments be raised. So there's occasions, I'm not going to say it's bluff and bluster, because obviously it's quite scary when HMRC come to call, but always come back to this point. The legislation is what the legislation says. Their interpretation of that is their interpretation of it. And it doesn't mean to say it's always right, which is why cases end up in the courts. Tribunals are held in order for an independent panel to make that view. So I'm not sure if people have got any other, I can see some technical questions in here. There was somebody who was asking about Alicia, a specific query on grant-funded retrowork. If external wall insulation is implied to a property which would attack zero rate, yes, and a ventilation system is required to ensure the insulation is compliant to retrofit under a single plot supply, would this be zero or standard rate due to the ventilation? That is exactly the point about, is that ventilation a separate supply, or is it integral and ancillary to the actual core supply, which is the external wall insulation? Now, that's going to be a fact-based conversation, Lisa. So that's nothing we can sort of say, oh, yes, absolutely. That would depend on the nature of the contract, the values involved, but it would certainly be the area where we would be having a conversation saying, how does this fit in terms of the zero rating? Right, ladies and gentlemen, it is 10:30, and if I know nothing else about life, I know when to stop talking about VAT. So I'm going to close down the session. Can I, before I do so, and before you all disappear into the sunset, can I just launch a feedback poll, please? And here it comes. Just to see if this has made the difference that we wanted it to make, to encourage you to join in with a consultation. So I've just put a little poll up. It's only a couple of questions. If you could just, before you dip out, if you could just have a quick flick through and put your answers into those so that we know where we are. Thanks, Joanne. Appreciate that. I'm glad it was helpful to you. But as I say, if those of you who are left could just contribute and put into the feedback questions, I'd be most grateful. And it doesn't matter if your answer is don't know, because that tells us, you know, in terms of stuff that we need to be doing to make sure people are more aware. Our details are on the screen. If you do need to get in touch with us, I put 2 email addresses up there as we're transitioning to this new brand that we're working within, so you can get us under both. But I do hope this has been a good and useful session to you. So I'm going to stop recording, and I'll just wait here for the polls to be completed.